So let me introduce myself. My name is Mitsos. I'm a Greek journalist, chief editor of the newspaper Tanea, and I will chair this panel. Well, 3 weeks ago, I was reading an article in The Economist about, the title was, "In the Future, Eurasia Will Rule the World." And it says that when J.R.R. Tolkien was asked how he came to write The Lord of the Rings, he replied, "I wisely started with a map and made the story fit." So if we look at the map of the world today, we see, among other things, the geopolitical map, I mean, not the geographical map. We see a very strong China, a China towards which are looking more and more the great powers of the world. The United States are looking there. It's not the first time. They have been looking since decades ago. Russia as well is looking. Europe as well is looking. But what a surprise. China is not the country that we thought it would become. It's a country that is not really copying the Western rules. It's a different thing. It has other values, not exactly the liberal political values of the West. And it's not only China, it's also Russia and it's other powers as well that are perhaps leading the example, that are they're showing the road of a different model. Strong economy, but not so strong in human rights and liberal values. So is this the paradigm of the new globalization? That's the question of this panel, and don't want to speak more. I give the chair to Mr. Cheng, who is to my right, and he is Director and Senior Fellow in the China Center for Foreign Policy in Brookings, USA. Please.
Thank you, Michael. I'm honored both to speak to this distinguished audience and speak along with my esteemed fellow speakers. I would like to applaud the host of the Delphi Economic Forum for devoting this session to China, the second largest economy, and arguably the most ambitious economic powerhouse in today's world. The title of this session is China 2019, a new paradigm of globalization, ? Now, in my 10 minutes opening remarks, I would like to make 3 points. First, my overall assessment of China's economic development model. Second, a quick review of the challenges and the backlash that China confronted last year. It was quite a bad year for China last year. And thirdly, the Chinese leadership's policy adaptation for this year and beyond. Now first, the overall assessment. In my view, I echo what Michael said. It is clearer today than any time before since the middle 1940s. The world is in the midst of the geopolitical and economic power shift. China has rapidly moved to the center stage of world affairs, playing a crucial role in economic globalization, infrastructure development, climate change, technology innovation, and multilateralism in various global affairs, largely taking advantage of President Donald Trump's unilateralism in US foreign policy under his watch. China's achievements in certain areas over the past few decades are truly astonishing. For example, in terms of poverty alleviation, during the past 40 years, as Bill Gates recently noted, 800 million people have been lifted out of poverty in China. That number is 10 times the population of Germany. While this development is widely acknowledged, some of China's economic and political pursuits are very controversial. Xi Jinping's socialism with Chinese characteristics has been seen by many people around the world as China's state capitalism, which not only restrains market access for foreign companies in China, but also undermines the post-Cold War liberal economic order. In that regard, China's development model, noticeably China's industrial policy and the so-called Made in China 2025, constitutes unfair trade and a non-market practice that is not in line with WTO rules. Now, this leads me to my second point, challenges and backlash that China confronts last year. The biggest challenge was, of course, from the United States, China's largest trade partner. This challenge includes the ongoing trade war between US and China, the US strategic shift in its approach to China from previously called engagement to now so-called decoupling, especially in the technological front, as evident in the case against Huawei, and also deterioration of the bilateral relationship in virtually all areas. There's no exception. Now, consequently, China's investment in the United States drastically dropped last year. Last year, the total investment in the United States was only 1/6 of the year before and 10% of 2016. And in the technological, IT sector, the mutual investment in both countries almost zero. So when you visit California, you can see that really it's quite shocking in this area. Now, for the Xi Jinping leadership, the pressure also comes from within China, especially from the country's middle class. Never before did China's fast-growing middle class confront such daunting economic challenges resulting from the last year's trade war with the United States. China's stock market was the worst performing one in the world last year. This is a statistic Donald Trump cited. Actually, he was right this time, not fake news. This is good news. This is right news. The Chinese middle class held reservations about Xi Jinping's strong support for state-owned enterprises, not only foreign companies, Chinese private sector also very strongly critical. And as US-China trade war mounted last year, Chinese social media witnessed a wave of criticism directed towards the party leadership. Fairly or unfairly, Chinese citizens went online to blame the leadership's overconfidence in China's economic leverage and the miscalculation of the President Donald Trump's administration's strategy towards China. In particular, President Xi Jinping's abolishment of presidential term limits last year was viewed as playing into Western fears about China. Now, how has President Xi Jinping addressed all of these criticism from both abroad and home? What policy adjustments will Xi Jinping likely adopt in 2019 and beyond? Now, let me very quickly address this third and final point. My main observation or argument or prediction is that Xi Jinping's policy adjustments can be very effective. Now, Xi Jinping's new economic strategy is twofold. On the domestic front, now he wants to promote private sector, especially small business firms with tax cuts and more loans. And on the international front, to create a better investment environment for foreign companies in China and to balance trade with the United States. Of course, still many people outside the world is quite cynical, but you can see the Wall Street already have tremendous money now going to China. The huge investment is going on. This probably reflects their assessment about China's market. So of course, it's still subject to debate whether that's long-term or just short-term. Now, also that China's economic overall priority actually is to promote economic relations with EU, with UK, with Japanese companies. You know, I had a chance to meet with the senior Chinese leaders, Vice President Wang Qishan twice in the past few months, and also some of the economic decision makers like Vice Premier Liu He. So I got the sentiment that they really wanted to play European card. And because this is based on understanding, they think there's nothing could be done with the United States, and unpredictable and very, very difficult. So that probably explains that Xi Jinping very likely will visit Italy and France later this month and I don't know whether the news already break out. Of course, still subject whether this will go along with his trip to the United States. So also, I think that kind of new strategy aim to achieve kind of balancing act among SOEs, private sector, and foreign companies. This is, again, this is what I call the new paradigm. Although it's not, probably not entirely new, but certainly Xi Jinping realized the importance of the other two sectors, private sector and foreign companies. But from a historical perspective, China's private sector has never been as dynamic as today. One can argue, as Chinese leaders argue. I think they have a point. Vice Premier Liu He has used the numbers 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 to describe the heavyweight role of the private firm in Chinese economy today. The private sector constitutes 50% of fiscal revenue, 60% of GDP growth, 70% technology innovation, 80% of the total jobs, and 90% for new jobs. Xi Jinping's new policy initiatives is to cut tax and provide loans have been well received by Chinese private entrepreneurs. I visited Zhejiang province a few months ago. Now have the one-day kind of decision. If you apply for small business, you should get one-day approval. It's quite remarkable. You cannot see this kind of approval for small business in China. So that reflects the policy change. Now, in contrast, the Western world that currently has a strong populist movements against economic globalization, China is different. Virtually all income groups in China benefit from the economic globalization. That differs from the United States. The United States probably only top 20% benefit from economic globalization. Other 80% actually did not score well. That explains some of people voted for Donald Trump at the first place. But China, basically, all groups benefit. Of course, the rich people benefit from more. So also, for China, going global is not a choice, but a necessity. China depends on foreign resources. China also has a strong economic incentive, in addition to strategic and political interest, to invest overseas and to improve its Belt Road Initiative. There's a new term is created called Quality Belt Road Initiative, which try to change the previous practice, not so much driven by market and etc. So I think that our next panel will highlight that. Now, finally, in my assessment, China's economic competitiveness will be even more strongly felt around the world in the years to come. Several urban clusters in China, such as the Guangdong Bay Area, the Shanghai Yangtze Delta, Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei corridor, and the Chongqing and Chengdu region, they all now have the new urban development plan, plus Central China and also Xi'an region. So they're about 5 or 6. They are all under Xi Jinping's proteges in terms of leadership, governors and the provincial party secretaries and etc. Now that was not the case 3 years ago or 4 years ago. Now, so overall message is actually decentralization. Let these urban clusters to perform, to compete. And these are not small entities. For example, Guangdong, the Bay Area. Just the Guangdong province itself alone ranked 15 in terms of global GDP by country, equal to Mexico. But you add Macau and Hong Kong, it's even higher. But again, it's not only just Guangdong, but also some other regions. So I think these economic, gigantic economic entities will likely have a strong impact on both China's economy and the global economic growth. Now, also in the wake of the rise of new Marxism in the United States, China probably will take advantage, will luckily attract a large number of world-class scientists and AI experts. Just a few days ago, a couple of weeks ago, Chancellor of Berkeley, California, Berkeley, she said the current discrimination against the Chinese and the Middle Eastern, the people with Middle Eastern background, the faculties, students, and visiting scholars, remind her the dark age in California's history. That tells you how bad the situation. Now, certainly, this is playing around in China's and some other countries' favor. So you will see these kind of top-notch scientists start to move around. So to conclude, we should not underestimate or misjudge the adaptability of China's paradigm of globalization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cheng. It was very interesting what you said, that globalization in China is much fairer than in the United States. Thank you. So I give the floor now to Mr. Adam Ward, who is Deputy Director at Chatham House in the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. I will admit that I had difficulty understanding exactly what the question of this session was getting at, but in any case, I've decided that the answer is no. I think it's clear to me that China has benefited from globalization, and globalization has created connections through which the rest of the world can benefit from China's economic development, and it has. But I would say that there's little in China's behavior to suggest a model or a paradigmatic attitude towards globalization, at least as traditionally understood. Like many countries, it retains strong protectionist instincts, and large elements of its economy remain closed or restricted. And of course, critics of China's economic policies in the US and Europe and elsewhere would argue that this has led to a certain amount of distortion and imbalances in the global economy. Now, all of that is debatable, of course, and maybe we will debate it here. I think one could say that China has absorbed as much globalization as it feels able to up until this point, subject to wider concerns about foreign influence in the commanding heights of the Chinese economy, subject to concerns about the status of strategic sectors of that economy, and also I think of the ability of China's economic managers to deal with forms of disruption that can result from the free flow of goods and capital and people. And clearly, the maintenance of a variety of capital controls and the fact that the renminbi hasn't been fully convertible has long stood as one example of the reticence that Chinese policymakers have felt about the robustness of their domestic arrangements to withstand imported forms of economic turbulence. So I think China's attitudes in these areas are arguably no different. Its risks assessments and calculus is arguably no different to that of many other countries around the world. But it matters more because China matters more. It looms very large in the global economy, as we were just hearing. But I suppose at the center of the question posed to this panel really is the extent to which China aspires to perform a form of international economic leadership of the kind that the United States has been willing to perform up until, I guess, fairly recently. And here again, I think the answer to that question looks like it's no. What China wants is to exert itself globally, yes, but to ensure that there's a greater degree of inclusion of Chinese perspectives in various elements of the global economic governance structures and its institutions. I don't think it wants to overturn the global economic order, and it doesn't want to assume the burdens of upholding the economic order, but it does want a bigger say. And it wants enough leverage, I think, to be able to promote the policies that it likes and to resist the ones that it doesn't. It wants enough freedom internationally for its companies to go global, to become national champions, to acquire foreign assets, and also to acquire elements of the strategic and critical infrastructures of other countries to the extent that it can, while, of course, shielding itself from similar acquisitive interest from outside countries. It wants global markets, yes, for its goods, but it clearly also wants to lessen its reliance on the global economy, and that ambition is evident in the efforts the Chinese government has undertaken to boost domestic demand and to rebalance the economy towards domestic demand generation as against a reliance on foreign trade. To the extent that it is reaching out in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, yes, this is an attempt to create strategic economic relationships with a large variety of different countries. But the massive architectural structure of the Belt and Road Initiative, I don't think, is intended as a multilateral framework in the form that maybe a traditionally globalizing approach would assume, but it's a series of largely asymmetrical bilateral relationships in which China maintains the upper hand and holds the strings. And I think it's also important to remember in this respect that China's economic outreach increasingly has a strong geopolitical character to it. Although many friends in China and elsewhere would differ with this opinion, I think it's possible to say now that there is enough evidence to suggest that China is evolving into not an exceptional power, but actually a very traditional form of great power in the model that we've seen it before. And it sees its economic relationships as a kind of geopolitical asset, as a measure of its geopolitical standing, and as economic policy is an important way by which it achieves national objectives. And that does include a degree of philanthropy towards countries that share its interests and share its values and who express a certain degree of deference. But it does also include a much more transactionalist and extractive approach to countries who don't resemble that description. So I think a new paradigm, I don't see that myself. It's a complicated picture, but it seems to me to have more in common with a revival of previous forms of economic behavior, some of which predate the age of globalization.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. Now it's a bit difficult to pronounce the name. I will try. Is Zhiqin she?
Yeah,
no?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Your pronunciation is very excellent. Okay.
And you're a professor in Tsinghua University.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for moderator, for the chairman. I'm very happy to be here to talk about the globalization in Chinese idea. Or there's two sessions I think relating to China. This one and later, 1 hour and later, also Belt and Road, the construction of China's Belt and Road Initiative in Southeastern Europe. I think that indicates that really China is now in the center, or the academic or debated center of the world, and also even the globalization is entitled the new paradigm for globalization. Maybe also China, a model for globalization in China. Maybe I don't think this is a very good term, or even China will not accept the Chinese practice in the past 4 decades is a model for the rest of the world. You know, the world of globalization, in fact, in China is in the process of changing. At the very beginning, maybe in 1980s, it is a world that maybe everybody wouldn't talk, that we are very afraid or frightened of this world. And step by step, we will try to accept, to acknowledge, realize that it's very important for us to develop our economy, because if you close the door to develop, that's impossible for you to develop. And now we said that we embrace, especially Xi Jinping, delivers the speech in 2017 in Davos Forum. He said we should try, because in the face of the deglobalization or anti-globalization, we should try to embrace, we should try to push forward globalization. And also this word, I think this word is connecting, is combined with another word called BRI. I think these two hot words are very popular words in China, even throughout the world. So if we talk about the globalization, we cannot separate it from the BRI. So even in China, yeah, we usually, President Xi usually said that the BRI is a Chinese way or Chinese approach to be involved in the world. Yeah, and so many, I think the very hot topic, very debatable words. So as a question about even the BRI, there are a lot of debates. Some scholars try to refer to, maybe I'll try very briefly, a strategy or initiative or personal or collective decision of Xi Jinping himself, or try to transfer Chinese domestic over capacity, or just build road, bridge, or the others, or the Chinese neighbor policy. A lot of ideas about BRI. Even I think the very beginning in BRI is from economy, is an economic term, not so many geopolitical implications. Yeah, I think the very beginning from is the economy, not from economy to comprehensive. And also Chinese, some scholars will try to refer to as a multiple platform, or second wave of reform and open up, even the foreign policy. Some scholars try to say that it's a China model, but Chinese government never officially said that, except BRI is a China model. Even the globalization is a China model. So we just try to Xi Jinping try to use a word, the global governance. We should try a Chinese solution to the global governance. So in recent years, in the face of the anti-globalization, China said that we should try to promote, because just one of the scholars said that China benefits from globalization as well as the world, and most of the world benefit globalization, because no globalization, no free movement of labor, capital, and service, etc. So it's natural. Nobody can stop it. So this is a lesson that China benefit from the past decades of the development. I think that what's important is that we emphasize that globalization is laissez-faire globalization, which caused a lot of problems, social problems, and even the social inequality. That's why the Western European countries, even the USA, is the populist right, or is the nationalism will come again. So China is means globalization is good, but we should try to keep it in the social control. So Xi Jinping said that we should try to have a globalization which is inclusive, which is balanced, which is favorable to all, which emphasizes win and win. So I think the why China will try to emphasize the balanced, inclusive, and win-win globalization. This is Chinese government get from its past experiences. Just like China, we try now. We accept market economy, but before that we don't think market economy is the characteristic of socialism. But in 1990s, Mr. Deng Xiaoping tried to say that market economy is just the instrument, is a way. Any country can use it. So we think that market we cannot. Market can also have a laissez-faire market, or just a laissez-faire market, or fundamentalist market. Yeah. But China said, we said the social market is just like German will emphasize, we want a social market. So Chinese called with a socialist market, also with Chinese characteristics. So social market and laissez-faire market. Globalization, laissez-faire globalization, and inclusive or balanced or something like globalization. So I think that this is why we realize why there is anti-globalization or deglobalization, because the globalization in the past is not so inclusive. So that's why China, after 4 decades of the development, we try to have the current anti-poverty campaign. We emphasize that everybody should benefit from globalization. I think this is the Chinese understanding of the globalization. That's why we try to emphasize globalization and BRI. BRI is the Chinese approach to globalization. We just want to build economic forum. We emphasize the win-win. win-win. So, and also he recently tried to emphasize that we should try to have the globalization or BRI, we should try to construct a community with a shared future for humanity. What's the meaning of a community with shared future for humanity? It means we emphasize this is a Chinese solution to the world problems, the deficits of peace, the deficits of development. Anyway, yeah, we try to emphasize a permanent peaceful world, a universal safe world, all kinds of, anyway, in one word, beautiful world. So I think this is a Chinese understanding that why we should, in the face of the anti-globalization or deglobalization, we should try to have the globalization as its inclusive side, as a win-win. Everybody can benefit. No country can stop globalization. We should try to keep it in balance. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I'll give the floor to Mr. Philippe Le Corre, senior fellow in Le Corre, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
In Harvard Kennedy School. I'm
Thank
sorry,
you
there's not an accent, you are right.
No, that's fine. I wish I was Le Carré, but it doesn't work this way. Thank you very much to the organizers. I'm delighted to be here again in the company of so many distinguished colleagues, including my former Brookings colleague sitting next to me, Cheng. I think another way to frame this question is, does China want to exert a global leadership role? And I've been sort of in and out of China for 30 years, and I've been lucky enough to interact with many Chinese in my life. And if I can just reflect over the past 2 years, you know, it's like this 2-year frame. You spoke, Cheng, about 2018, but let me go back to 2017, if you don't mind. I remember a trip to Beijing, spent a week meeting people right after the election of Donald Trump, or it was just before the election of Donald Trump, before the Davos speech, and people were welcoming me with a big smile and said, well, you know, how are you guys going to do now? You've got Brexit, you've got Donald Trump, you have the rise of populism, everything is falling apart. So, you know, it's like leading me to say, basically, you know, who is going to take over? So basically, you know, this Davos speech by Xi Jinping was important in the sense that China was presenting itself perhaps not as an alternative, but perhaps as, you know, a new model, certainly not for the Western world, I'll come to that in a minute, but certainly for the developing world. And also was stating clearly that it wanted to take center stage. And that term came back in the 19th Party Congress of the Communist Party. And, you know, the same year, 2017, you had the Belt and Road Initiative Summit, which was not so well attended by Western leaders, but that was meant to be a continuation of this statement of the Davos speech, which itself was, in a way, a logical continuity of what the party under Xi Jinping had been promoting, which is China's rise, basically. We're talking about China's rise. That's the central idea. But another central idea is whether China could thrive in the Trump era, whether China could appear as a rock of stability when the Western world is crumbling, and by appearing as a proponent of globalization. That was really what the Davos speech was about. Now, of course, there were other elements, and certainly the 19th Party Congress, the policy speech by Secretary General Xi, as well as the change of the two-term limits that was imposed, which Cheng Li mentioned as well, for allowing the Secretary General of the party to be president for more than 2 terms. There was the sense that perhaps the authoritarian regime, the authoritarian nature of the regime increased over this period. And to be honest, when you think about this message of globalization, of China being pro-globalization, in fact, in the West, the reality has been perceived quite differently for the past year and perhaps for the past couple of years. Firstly, nobody mentioned, or maybe not in great detail, the trade war, the US-China trade war. But basically, Donald Trump was completely misjudged by a lot of people, including in Europe, but also in China. And in fact, the trade war, I mean, there's a lot to say about the trade war, whether it's the right thing to do or not. But certainly, it has sort of arisen a sentiment, certainly in the Western world, that China's rise is coming, or it's already here, and that perhaps on trade and investment and financial matters, it needed to be addressed. And so it may be too early to say, you know, if the trade war was a good idea, but it has certainly shaken the thinking of many Western leaders, including in Europe, that perhaps China has now reached a certain stage where we should try to take action and perhaps engage with the Americans at some level. One of the consequences of this, and later on we'll have another session where I hope I'll be able to say a few words on China and Europe, which is my main field. But one of the results of this situation which I described, which is China's rise and including geo-economic rise, has been new restrictions in the US and in Europe, both in the US and in Europe, on Chinese investments, for example. Both sides of the Atlantic have reinforced the screening mechanisms of foreign investment, including Chinese investment. Secondly, there's been a pushback from the media, think tanks in some ways, and some governments about what China has been trying to do. So, you know, for a country that wants to be an alternative as a global power, it hasn't been very easy, as we heard before. And fourthly, and I'll say, I'll spend a couple of minutes on that, there's the question of soft power. So for a superpower to emerge and to exert its influence, soft power is critical. And we haven't spoken too much about security dimensions, but that's also, you know, there's a lot to say about this, the diplomatic rise. But certainly on soft power, the question is whether China's rise has been a plus, has been well taken by especially public opinions in the West. And if you look at what Pew Research is doing, in fact, well, the US might be down in terms of favorability index, that's for sure, from 48% to 30%. That's pretty significant according to Gallup. But China is not really rising either. And if you look at 2018, you only have about 43% out of 25 countries. That includes, you know, countries in Africa, in the Middle East, and who have a favorable view of China, and none in the West. So again, the problem is China has not managed to be convincing enough to the Western public that it actually means well, and perhaps one of the problems has been, you know, on one hand, a sort of more repressive regime, certainly very bad human rights records, the problem of Xinjiang, and so the censorship, which has been increasing, and at the same time, economically, a country that has not been as open as it's been claiming. The state dominates, even though there are private companies in China. But, you know, it's been difficult for foreign firms. And that has reflected badly. If you speak to business people in Europe, for example, they would tell you that the fact state-owned enterprises have such a weight in the Chinese economy, certainly in key sectors, you know, it really makes it challenging for them. At the same time, the West is fairly open and fairly easy for China to invest in. That includes Greece, that includes some of the countries in this region. So just to conclude, I think the paradox perhaps is that China wants to be a global player, or it's becoming a global player anyway. Its message doesn't seem to be to be coming across that well, maybe for the political reasons I mentioned, maybe because economically it's not so clear how the West particularly will benefit from this rise, and perhaps I should make an exception for the developing world, which of course has a very more positive view of China, but in the West it's been complicated.
Thank you, Mr. Lecor. And our last speaker is Athanassios Platias, a professor at the University of Piraeus.
Thank you. Let me start with a disclaimer. I'm not a China expert, unlike all these fellows. I have never visited China, so I may get China completely wrong. But I have been asked to comment on China from an international relations perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, and from a strategy perspective. And my assumption, which may be completely wrong, is that China is not different than other great powers. So if we have the tools to analyze great powers, then we can analyze China. So I start from this kind of perspective. I don't see a China model. I don't see an Asian way of war or whatever. Strategy is universal. The logic is universal. So, as a realist, I start from hard power indicators. China is a demographic superpower, 1.4 billion. It's also an economic powerhouse. It used to be a fraction of the US GDP, now it's 60%, 62% of the US GDP in nominal terms, and probably in the next 15 years it will overcome the US. If you use other indicators like PPP, purchasing power, it's probably even bigger than the US. Technologically, it's competing eye to eye with the US, and militarily, it has the second biggest defense budget in Earth. Actually, it's 4 times bigger than the third power, which is Russia. It's still far away from the US, because the US spends more than 700 billion. China is around 180. Still, the gap is big, but compared with the third power, Russia, it's huge. So all this kind of net assessment means that China is already the number 2 in the international system. But still, it's not a global superpower. It's not a global power that can reach everywhere. It's a regional power that is rising. Now, globalization, to return to the issue of the panel, has definitely helped China, and also it has helped the West. Globalization brought prosperity and peace, but also brought asymmetrical increase of Chinese power. So the issue of win-win, yes, it's here. Both sides are winning. But from an international relations perspective, the critical question is who is winning more? For whom globalization works better? And the conclusion that the United States government reached is that globalization certainly is working in favor of China. That's why US is backtracking from globalization. Globalization is not in its interest anymore, and resorts to unilateralism. So that's, and it also means that the post-World War II liberal order did not work. Did not work especially for China, Because what was the idea is tame the beast and transform it. Take China and make it like a normal kind of liberal democracy. This did not work. So for this reason, there are dramatic changes in how the US perceived China, and I will come to that. Now, from an international relations perspective, again, one way to analyze it is through Allison's book, The Thucydides Trap, what's happening when a rising power meets the dominant power. Well, war is not inevitable, but there is competition. And I think we are seeing that increasing competition. But we see other troubling phenomena, like a technological arms race, which reminds me of the Anglo-German naval arms race that led to World War I. And also, I see a typical application of security dilemma. Unlike you, for example, I interpret the Belt and China Road Initiative as not as China's globalized policy, but as a purely defensive measure or in geopolitical terms. I mean, the US controls the oceans. If the competition is brought at this point, China has lost. So it tries to build a continental route and a continental axis. So it makes perfect sense what you do, but what is for you a defensive measure, it's considered very offensive for the West. Any country try to unite Eurasia under its leadership and influence is a no-no for the West for the known geopolitical issues. So all these things has made the United States in particular to change its policy from engagement to containment. So the way that I interpret, not Trump's tweet, but you know, the official strategic text of the United States, the grand strategy, the national security strategy, is that China is considered the #1 threat, the #1 antagonist is considered revisionist power that actually has put the bar very high. In the 100th year of celebration of the Communist Party, to displace the United States as a #1. You know, this is driving the American crazy. Somebody comes and says, we will become stronger than you. Or, even if it's in 20, 30 years' time. So this has brought the countries head-to-head, directly in a Cold War. Now, the Cold War is taking place in a lot of dimensions. First of all, diplomatically. The US is cleverly using the fear of Chinese rise to the neighbors, because the neighboring countries will be the first to feel China rise. So it's putting a kind of balancing coalition which is similar to World War II containment. The four basic pillars is the US, Australia, Japan, and India, but it includes other countries. This is typical dealing with the Soviet Union, containment, and at the diplomatic level. Then there is containment at the military level. I mean, look all this, how the US increases its defense budget and its emphasis that it gives to neutralize all Chinese military advantage. It's economic, trade war. It's technology, technological denial, and a kind of existential race who is becoming #1 on technology. But also, and most importantly, it's something that happened on the Cold War. It's political. It's a kind of ways to undermine the regime, both with nationalism or with other measures. So what I see, it's really a competition of two systems, using all instruments of power, from technological to military to diplomatic to economic, of course, on trying to undermine each other. It's completely post-World World War II. It's completely Cold War. So in my understanding now, the two systems are competing along a different dimension, fragility and resilience. In the long run, the US managed to compete with the Soviet Union on which system was more fragile under pressure. And the Soviet Union collapsed under pressure. I see the same logic applied for the United States. The analysis is that the Chinese system, it's more fragile than the American one. So there is more pressure there to change the strategy. Now, I can understand, and I'm finishing with two short points. I can understand what China is facing a typical problem in international relations. We call it status inconsistency. If your power raises and your status is not the same, you try to address the status. But trying to address this status, you look threatening, especially to the neighboring. You see, in international relations, the cold rule is balancing. You balance, but what do you balance? You balance power or threat. And I'm afraid the inevitable rise of Chinese power has brought perceptions of threat, and that's very destabilizing, because then you have a kind of Cold War dynamic on balancing threat, and that's precisely now what you are seeing in the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, which definitely becomes the center of world politics, the way that Europe and Eurasia used to be before. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Platias. So we are we took a bit more time, as usually happens. So I think we have some under 20 minutes for discussion, or even less, in order to have the finishing remarks of the speakers. So please, if you can just show how many of you want to ask questions, so I think we can take them all together. It's more practical, and the speakers will answer afterwards. I don't see much competition, but I don't know how to encourage you. Okay, no, so one there. Just 1, 2, okay, 3, 4. Okay, so that's it. So please. Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Andy Marston from the British Embassy here. I was wondering, how can US and Chinese security interests be resolved in the South China Sea peaceably?
So do you want to ask everybody? We have 4 questions. Let's ask them all together, please, and then we'll see how.
Hello, my name is Iskandar Akobaev, and I'm coming from Kazakhstan. As it was mentioned that China was portrayed as the emerging global power, but speaking with the Chinese experts around the world, they usually kind of stress that we are not global power, but rather we are learning power, actually trying to adapt to the global system and benefit from it. My question is specifically to Professor Cheng Li, and do you agree with the statement that the Chinese strategy in the world is universal, or Chinese approach to the global politics has its own characteristics in its kind of own way?
Okay, next question was, sir, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Vasilis Strigas. I'm based at the Belt and Road Institute at Tsinghua University. So from the 3 big elephants in the room when it comes to trade, it's China, it's the United States, but also the European Union. And the European Union right now has a double confrontation on the one side with the Trump administration, and on the other side based on trade access and market access with the Chinese. So I'm trying to understand, perhaps from a European perspective, how are the Europeans going to balance the 2 behemoths, the Chinese and the Americans? And just something I just read, Germany is trying to have a non-intelligence treaty, an intelligence treaty with the Chinese in terms of Huawei. So if there's enormous US strategic, technological pressure to ostracize China from the European market, is there anything the Europeans can do autonomously? Thank you.
And the last question was? No? Change his mind? Okay. Okay, so I think we have 15 minutes, and if the 5 speakers spend 3 minutes each, it would be great. So perhaps we start opposite turn, if you agree. So perhaps Mr. Platias?
Let me listen to...
Okay, so you want Mr. Lecor to answer for 3 minutes?
Sure. Well, I can. I'll leave the Cheng Li question to Cheng Li, and I will maybe address your question if you like. So obviously, Europe is not a superpower in sort of what Professor Platias would call a superpower, but certainly it's a big market, and it's if you look at certainly the Belt and Road Initiative, of which you seem to know very well, all these roads, whether they are maritime or land roads, they all lead to Europe. There is an ambition from China to sell more to Europe. So from that vantage point, the European Union happens to have competence on trade. This is what the EU is about, and it's now also somewhat extended that power to investment, which is quite interesting. There are many stories about this, but that gives the EU as a whole, the 28 or 27 soon to be, a certain leverage point over China. Now, obviously, from a more sort of diplomatic and geopolitical point of view, things are more complex because Europe doesn't have such a strong presence in Asia, in the South, on the South China Sea issues and all this. But I would argue that the past year has been quite significant in terms of EU-China relations. First of all, when you speak to High Representative Mogherini, she's enthused about her relationships with China. She said the EU-China meetings are very happy and there's so much going on, and there may be a reason for that. Secondly, there's been 2 major achievements on the European side, from my point of view. One of them is to have adopted a kind of non-binding process to look at foreign investments in the EU. That includes, of course, Chinese investments, but not exclusively. Why is it a success? Because most countries in the world have this kind of mechanisms, including China, in fact, for that matter, including Japan, including the United States. So there's no reason why Europe should be this open game where people can come and grab things, as one minister once said. So looking at investments in a rational way, when it comes to technology, when it comes to infrastructures, how significant they are for the national security or the state of our economies, that's very important. And then talking on an equal basis with China, with other players, I think it's important. Secondly, another achievement has been, and I'm talking in Greece here in particular, because I know that when I did some of my work here, I was told, where were the Europeans, where were the Americans when we were sort of having so many troubles, and we had to lease our harbor to a Chinese company. So the EU now has something called the EU-Asia Connectivity Platform, which is a plan to try to use connectivity between Asian countries and European countries. Now, it may sound, and I'm not going to go into details, but it may sound a bit vague, but it's actually providing, alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm not saying we should be against the Belt and Road Initiative. That's not my point. The point is that there should be alternatives on the tables. And I think, it's pretty good that the EU as a whole is waking up, and that some individual countries as well.
Thank you. You want Mr. Xi give a brief answer?
So just a very quick a comment about these questions about the China and USA, how to try to cooperate in South Asia. I think that the China Southern Sea is traditionally the issue of the territory disputes. So we have China and has disputes with Vietnam, with Philippines, especially in the just a few years ago, yeah, the debate is very, very serious. But we can try to, bilaterally or multilaterally, we can try to solve these issues. Now, Philippines is a very good partner, trade partner with China, and Vietnam. Also, we have very normal relations compared with a few years ago. So I don't think the USA is stay in South China Sea can stabilize this region. I think that other issues can try to be solved by bilaterally. And also the second, I want to our Kazakhstan's colleague said that is learning power. Also, China is a learning power. In the past decades, we have been trying to learn from European countries, try to learn from the USA, and also in all the many of the achievements that we try to have a very good cooperative relations with Europeans. We learn a lot from your management, from your technology. So now China is still in the process of learning. So don't be afraid of China's rise, sudden rise. And the third is about how to try to balance. Europe try to balance. You know, China's foreign policy is try to one foreign policy is try to have a normal relations, good cooperative relations with all great powers. USA the European Unions. And when the great powers relations was proposed a few years ago, I know that the EU is very, very afraid that is EU a great power in China's second foreign policy. Second policy paper toward Europe, toward the EU, that we said the EU is a great power. So I think we have very good relations with Europe, and also we want to have very good relations with USA. We have a comprehensive strategic partnership with Europe. So that's why we have, just last year, the Chinese government issued its third policy paper toward the EU. That indicates that still we pay much attention to the cooperation with EU, and I hope that EU still try to regard China as a very, very good cooperative partnership. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Ward?
I'll just touch on the question around the South China Sea. I'm afraid the only answers to how China and the US can avoid conflict there are self-restraint and mutual military deterrence. Because the region lacks the sort of institutions that could seriously address and try to arbitrate and resolve those things. And China, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, is not going to welcome any process. In fact, it will resist it that attempts to look at this in that body. What we have in the dispute is a collision, really, between the importance the United States places on freedom of navigation operations as a principle, and Chinese principled positions, as it were, on questions of national sovereignty. It's a collision between American credibility with American allies and Chinese domestic political legitimacy. And none of those things afford any great flexibility. It's clearly a test case for Chinese attitudes generally towards mediation and international arbitration. It doesn't seem to have expressed a huge amount of enthusiasm up until now. And it's also the key international test case about Chinese attitudes towards the use or resort to force to resolve disputes. Now, in the current situation, I think it would be quite dangerous if the Chinese government felt that the Trump administration was less interested than other American administrations have been in these sorts of issues and upholding the existing regime. I think that would be a very bad calculation, and I'm not sure that the Chinese are going to make it. And of course, another constraint on Chinese behavior is the knowledge that whatever positions they strike in the South China Sea are going to be watched very, very closely in the East China Sea, so-called, where Japan will draw very significant conclusions if China attempts any peremptory military options to resolve the disputes in its favor.
Professor Platias, I think,
I want to hear the response to the universality.
Okay.
Well, all these three questions are excellent. For the first one, we are really in a very dangerous period. A few months ago, as we know, that both sides just 41 meters away from a military conflict. If then the DOD Secretary Mattis was not there, probably you already see some very serious casualty. Now, I agree with my colleague that analysis, there's very lack of mechanism and lack of the dialogue, and both sides become tougher. At this point, one mechanism actually ironically become important is the personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. They could call each other if the crisis occur. So that's the reason that China wanted to keep that personal relationship. But the irony is that even his bureaucracy have some reservation with President Donald Trump, not mention about Congress, media, and the interest group, and the DOD, military, etc. So that's added more complexities. So again, South China Sea is a very dangerous spot, but it's not the only one. And the Taiwan and the East China Sea and the digital era is also areas. Also, there are a lot of potential conflict. So it is a very tough time. I mean, I'm glad you raised that issue. Now, in terms of the second question about China's interest in the international system, now this is a very dynamic situation. Over the past 10 years, is before Xi Jinping, China's statement is that China wants to be at the head table in various institutions. China wants to have a say in major decisions. But China never said we wanted to replace that system. And Chinese leadership interpretation is it's United States, want to change that system, a liberal order, not China. I mean, whether economic liberalization or various things, climate change, and etc. Now, the situation is because of decoupling going on. The decoupling is real. It's in the IT industry. It's already happening. But also, we talk about Eric Schmidt saying that in the future there will be U.S.-led, internet, China's-led internet, and European maybe-led internet. Then also financial systems could also split. Of course, this is still may take some time. But if that's the scenario, then China will become quite troubling, because China wants to establish its own. To a certain extent, you can see that China's internet is already has its own characteristics. So that's the things we do not know. And, but at the moment, I think the world is moving that direction, and in cyber area particularly. But hopefully that someday that they will find that it's probably too costly, it's too dangerous, and not conducive. But again, we do not know. But this is linked to your question about the three powers. It's really, in a way, you're right. In terms of economic power, EU, China, United States, almost share, almost equal. That make EU is very, very important. In terms of value, certainly EU countries sided with the United States. You mentioned about the list of issues, whether Xinjiang with human rights, political censorship, etc. Right? So China really can not really win the hearts and minds of European nations if China did not improve on the political front. But at the moment, we do not see that's happening. But at the same time, China is such a huge market. That market probably in many ways even more important than the United States for the reason that we discussed, because of China's trying to attract EU, particularly in the current situation. So that will enhance EU's leverage. I think this is healthy. But the situation is now we are in a situation that the country need to take a side, whether it be with the United States or with China. I mean, National Security Advisor John Bolton already said that the African countries need to take a position, but actually African countries already took a position. They were siding with China, along with some of the South American countries. But my observation is probably EU countries, most of them were siding with the United States. So this is a very dangerous situation. It's a new version of the Cold War. Of course, it will never be the same, right? Because of economic development, because of technology, because of many other factors. Right. So I think that that should be the leverage, in my view, to maintain the balance, to push the United States and China move to the right direction for the world we care deeply in terms of unilateralism, in terms of economic cooperation, into, most importantly, prevent a war scenario.
Okay, Mr. Platias, you have 1 minute, please. We have to be very strict with time. Thank you.
Okay, on the European issue. Clearly, Europe has geopolitical interests with the United States and economic interests with China. The level of trade is bigger than the transatlantic. But also it's crystal clear to me that Europe will face sooner or later the following dilemma that the United States always puts to its allies, either with us or against us. And how Europe will respond in that case, I don't know. My prediction is that it will divide. It will not have a kind of pan-European response to that question. So it will be one other issue that Europeans will go either way. Now, on the South China Sea, which is not the only issue, but Japan, I'm very pessimistic. The two countries are in collision course. The issue are broader. For example, the United States makes the issue of freedom of the seas. It is not only the United States. The Brits are sending warships to reaffirm the principle of the freedom of the seas. And despite the fact that the two presidents can talk to the phone directly of each other, the level of nationalism that is increasing makes it very difficult for anybody to compromise. My typical case here will be the Cuban crisis involved in the Cold War. It was easy for the Soviet Union to compromise. I'm not sure if we have an escalation and a similar crisis will be easy for either China or the United States to compromise. So I'm very pessimistic about the escalatory potential of the South China Sea. And don't forget that the Peloponnesian War did not start with a kind of rational, cold decision, changes of balance of power, let's stop it. It started through allies fighting each other and entrapment and little crisis escalating. And that's precisely the danger of South China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.